All right, we're live finally. Sorry about that. I had my camera die a little bit, so I got out a backup camera that's actually better than my main camera, but I usually use it for a different setup. So here we are. This is Right Stream number 2. I wanted to do one last week, but I got caught up in real life stuff, mainly in trying to sell my house and then purchase another house. So that has been occupying a lot of my time. I've still been doing a little bit of writing. What I'd like to do today, besides field questions, is start with a couple of special introductory topics that I feel like I can pontificate on a little bit. But before I get to that, do you guys have any questions to start it off? I will be reading the chat right now. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. If you heard the music playing, by the way, that's my music. That's the last album I came out with, which was called Memories Adrift, a fun little ambient instrumental rock album, if you like that kind of music. So the first thing I want to talk about is the drafting process, because a lot of people are still doing NaNoWriMo, or National Novel Writing Month. And National Novel Writing Month focuses primarily on the drafting process, that is, writing all of the prose and dialogue, the initial writing of the book, hopefully up until the end. It's only one of the middle phases of all of the phases. The first phase would be planning. That can be zero planning or lots of planning, depending on who you are, what you like to plan in advance, what genre you're in. Science fiction and fantasy usually require more planning, likewise historical fiction. And then the drafting is where you're actually writing the book. Then, of course, there is the editing or revision phase, which is where you fix any kind of problems that were there from the initial run-through of writing the book. And then you get to the publication phase. So in December, people have asked me to do some guides on how to self-publish, and I will do that. The problem with self-publishing is that there are a million different ways to do it. You can give somebody a basic guide for how to traditionally publish, because once you have an agent, that agent is going to be pulling you through that process. That's really how they earn their money, right? But with self-publishing, there's a lot more to it. So in December, we'll be getting into all the different things you have to think about to self-publish. Really, it's independent publishing. Self-publishing would be you print the book out yourself and sell it to someone. What we really mean when we say self-publishing is independent publishing, going through Amazon or a number of other different subsidiaries, or going through a different company that will distribute all of your ebooks and allow people to buy them on various storefronts. That's actually kind of a complicated process. So stay tuned for that in December. I figured that would be something kind of interesting for people who maybe finished a book or who are trying to think ahead about what they want to do with it when they're done with it. But for now, let's talk about the drafting process. The drafting process is basically where you are writing the initial prose and the initial dialogue. I've talked about the sticking to like a word count goal or something like that. Since NaNoWriMo is focusing on trying to write 50,000 words, which could be a complete book depending on how complicated a book you want to write. Because it's focused on that word count goal, I think a daily word count goal is very effective, or a weekly one, depending on how your schedule works, because some people like to work more on the weekends than during, the weekdays. It just depends how you like to manage your process. But word count goals are very effective if you're trying to get to a word count. If you don't want to worry about word count, it's better to think about devoting time to work. Like you're going to do an hour a day of writing. Now, an hour a day of writing for some writers is 45 minutes of looking at Twitter and 15 minutes of writing, or some combination thereof. It's really hard to do an hour straight of very deep practiced work. That's something that you have to build up to. So if you're brand new to writing, it's a really good idea, just like if you're brand new to guitar, because I've taught at this point like thousands of guitar students. If you're brand new to an instrument, it's really hard to practice for an entire hour. It's much easier to practice 15, 20, 30 minutes. So if you can sit down and focus intensely for 15, 20, 30 minutes and write as much as you can write, you'll find that you kind of hit a spot a few minutes in where you're really able to do it well, and you're really able to turn that focus into productive work. But a lot of times your focus will fail simply because you don't have a lot of practice doing that. So if you're new to this, start with like a couple minutes, maybe 30 minutes twice a day, so you have some time to let your mind relax, and just focus on the amount of time you actually spend doing deep work. Because in some cases, different parts of the book require different amounts of time. 1,000 words in one part of the book may take, for me, hours to write, and in another part of the book, 1,000 words is 20 minutes. It just really depends where I am in a book. So in some cases, it's very helpful to think about time. That's really what I've been doing recently, is when I finally get down to write, and I usually get to start writing at between 10:30 and midnight, I will write for an hour, and then I will do what other light work I need to do, answer emails if I can get to them, or do whatever. And then I make myself do something that is non-writing, that is the opposite of that, like relaxation. So I'll usually play a game before bed, and I've noticed if I do not do that, if I don't take the time to walk away from the computer and go play a game or read a book, then I will not be able to sleep when I get to bed. My mind will be too engaged in the process of creation for me to be able to sleep, and then it may take me 3-4 hours to get to sleep, and then I'm only operating on like 2 or 3 hours of sleep. So I've learned that you have to actually make some time to relax as well. So that relationship between focus and relaxation is very important. So I'd encourage you to think about that as a different way to approach the drafting process. Rather than thinking about, I got to write 1,000 words a day, or 1,500 words a day, or 2,500 words a day, or 10,000 words a day or something, think about how much time you can actually devote to focused work. If you say, well, I'm going to write for 8 hours a day, and you've never focused that intensely creatively for 8 hours, you'll find it's very difficult. It's a lot easier to work up to 8 hours. My experience as a concert guitarist, as a classical guitarist, took me years before I could sit down and practice for a whole hour at a time. And even when I was practicing 5-6 hours a day in preparation for like a recital or a season of playing, I would still take a break every hour and do something else. Go use the bathroom, look at my, read a newspaper. This is back before smartphones, right? So I would never look at my phone, but I might pull out my Game Boy and play Golden Sun for a few minutes, and then I go back in and I'd practice for another hour, and I'd go have lunch, go teach a couple classes, come back, practice another hour, go teach more classes, come back, practice another hour. So I had 5 or 6 hours of practice split up over the day. I used to get up at around 5, and I'd go I'd go to work, and then I'd practice for an hour and a half, and then I'd teach, and then I'd practice, and then I'd go drive to my next job and teach, and then practice. So splitting it up over the day, when people are like, man, you practice 6 hours a day, it's like, yeah, but it's so split up that the focus is not that difficult to achieve. It becomes a lot easier. All right, let's see if there's any questions before I go on to anything else. Have I ever read The Lord of Elfhand's Daughter? I have not read that. There's a lot of books I haven't read. There's so many books to read. If you make a suggestion for a book, I'll try to write it down when I'm done with the stream, and maybe I'll get to it, maybe I won't. I don't have a whole lot of promises. One thing that I one thing I do with books now is that I give them a good college try. Give them a few thousand words, a few dozen pages to grip me. If I get 50 pages in to a book and I don't like it or I'm bored by it, I don't feel bad anymore about just putting that book down. I don't think I've lost a lot in my life to miss out on certain books that aren't able to really engage me, especially once I've given them a really good chance to engage me, and then just move on to another book. Or sometimes I'm halfway through a book, I get a little bored, I put it down, I read another book, and I come back to that book later. My main goal right now is to avoid boredom, because if you're forcing yourself to read, then it's no longer the pleasure activity that it really ought to be. It becomes something that's like, I'm supposed to read this, and you're back in grade school trying to read, or not grade school, but high school, trying to read Pride and Prejudice and just being bored out of your mind because it's not a story that has any relevance to you. But it's something that you're supposed to read and supposed to understand the importance of. There's lots of books that you're supposed to understand the importance of, but at this phase of my life, I try not to spend a lot of time being bored or annoyed by anything that I'm supposed to do to have fun, right? That's why I wanted to get into writing books, is I enjoy reading books. Are you trying to do a novel this month? I am doing a novel this month. It's Angels versus Vampires, inspired by Magic decks. It's kind of weird. It's just something I came up with the story last year. I didn't have time to work on it. I decided, well, I'm gonna write it. It's not gonna be a particularly long book. I'm anticipating it's gonna be about 60,000 words. I usually anticipate a certain amount and then I write a little bit more. So in this case, I'm anticipating about 60,000 words, so it might end up being 75,000. So that'll probably be finished in December. I'll probably start working on promo materials towards the end of this month and then continue drafting so that I can be sending out stuff to my email list and putting stuff up on Patreon for people to check out earlier. And then I'll finally try to ship it close to Christmas. I find that if I give myself a hard deadline, I'm able to really come up with some amazing stuff in a short amount of time. So I am doing that. It's very different from what I've done before, and probably it's nowhere near the normal genres I do. But it was just an idea, and sometimes it's good to follow through with your ideas, particularly if you find the process of writing them interesting. And in this case, this is the second book I've written. You guys will not see the first book I've written that has this idea, but there's no sun. So it's a world without sunlight. So a world without sunlight, that produces a lot of interesting setting elements and a lot of horror opportunities as well. So I'm enjoying that process because I don't get to write quite, people say that sometimes my books have a little bit of gore in them. I kind of like that harsher element sometimes. So I'm kind of enjoying having that right now in that particular book. Didn't realize you were also a guitar teacher. That's how this channel started. It started as a guitar channel. So all of my early videos, the first 100 videos, are all guitar videos. I was a classical guitarist by profession for a decade. When I moved out of Las Vegas, I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I have some videos on that. Why I decided to stop doing classical guitar. Short answer is, you get tired of doing the same thing for a long time and playing the same songs. And you also get tired of not making a ton of money and not having your income grow, whereas other things that you can do have the opportunity for growth. It kind of feels like you're just spinning your wheels and you've been doing the same thing for a long time. It would be like, it'd be like having one job that has no added responsibilities or pay for like 5 or 6 years. Anyone can think of how that would just kind of grind on you after a while. You have to feel like you're having some growth, like you're moving towards something in your life. Anyway, I have longer videos on that. In your experience, is it better to practice focused work in the morning or the evening? It really depends on who you are. I do it in the evening. In the morning, I wake up and it's basically all attending to my son and to the practical things I have to do in life. Right now, I stay home with my son. My wife and I switched our work arrangement. She was staying home. Now I'm staying home. And that was basically because we could make the same amount of money with her working one less day a week. So my wife only works normally about 4 days a week. And then I stay home and then I do my work from home. So it's kind of it's a little bit of a gain there. So it really depends on you. If you wake up and your mind is active in the morning, you can do it in the morning. And even better, if you can wake up and do it in the morning and then do it in the evening as well, then you're just getting extra done. So sometimes I can get a little bit of work done in the morning. If I could pull out my laptop and while my son's playing, I'll try to bang out a couple hundred words if I can, but usually he requires so much attention that it's not possible for me to do that. So it really just depends on who you are. I'm a late night kind of guy. That's when my mind is most engaged. I've had a whole day to think about what I'm going to write. And so when I get and sit down at the document, I'm very mentally prepared to just put down the next couple events. Let's see what else. Am I a fan of Bloodborne? If so, what are your thoughts on it? I have Bloodborne. I've played it. I don't have time to be excellent at it or to really play through the game. So I don't really have an opinion on it other than that. Kind of like Dark Souls. It's fun gameplay, I guess, but I just don't have the time to really focus on it and be good at it. Aesthetically, I like it aesthetically. It has kind of a dark gothic feel to it. It kind of reminds me of Diablo, I guess. And so that's good. Otherwise, I don't really have an opinion on it. Other people who've played Bloodborne very extensively and who've gotten very good at it, they're probably better to talk about it. Are there any elements of a story, maybe descriptions or dialogue, for example, that you find are easier to skimp on more in a first draft than others? So the things that I think are easier to skimp on in a first draft is the prose. So that is the sentences that aren't dialogue. Dialogue is the thing you should focus on first and foremost. And dialogue is the first thing you should look at when you're trying to revise. Dialogue carries stories, and not just in movies. It carries stories big time in books. And that is something that I've noticed myself when I'm reading, and it's something I've noticed when I'm writing. It's really rare that I find a writer whose prose is so good I'm not willing to skip it to look at dialogue if I'm in a hurry. Michael Moorcock, one of the reasons he's my favorite writer is his prose is very, very efficient. He writes good sounding prose, but there's never a ton of prose without some dialogue breaking it up. And that's one of the things that I try to practice. So if you have a beginning of a scene, you can start with dialogue and you pepper in the prose that is describing the scene and let the dialogue do most of the work. If you are spending more than half a page doing a lot of description and exposition for a scene, it's probably too much. The dialogue will tend to provide a lot of context that you don't realize will be provided. So one of the things that I try to do with my books is make them efficient. So if I have 100 and, Water of Awakening, which you can get, there's a link up at the top of the chat. Water of Awakening is 115,000 word book, I think. And in that 115,000 words, there's a lot of story. And there's a lot of story because I don't spend a lot of time on descriptions, and I don't spend a lot of time. I mean, there is a lot of prose, but I don't spend a lot of time, describing every detail. You want to describe the details that matter. So if there's one thing on your drafting process you could skimp on, it's probably the prose. But it depends on how your mind works. Some people really like to write the prose, and then the dialogue is something that they have to do repeats on. I tend to really focus on the dialogue and really think about how my characters are going to talk to each other. And then the prose is there to contextualize the dialogue. I kind of think of it in reverse. And that's actually one of the things that you can do if you're having trouble with the scene, is you can just write the dialogue and then figure out how the prose needs to go with that. And adding to that, some of the writers that I have liked the least are the ones that spend the most time on hoop-de-doodle, on just writing prose that sounds pretty. And that's, for the most part, that's mostly 20th century writers up to the postmodern, so up to about 1960, with the exclusion of Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway is very, very efficient. But if you look at someone like Joyce, it's interesting from a study perspective, but it's awful to read something like Ulysses. And I was having an email conversation with one of you guys about Ulysses. I think is that it's interesting from if you're studying in a literature class to talk about what is in that book, but it's really not very fun to read. And the reason it's not fun to read is that it doesn't just tell you the story. It doesn't give you the story. It doesn't have any of the meat that you actually get attached to. Likewise, if you go far back to before a lot of the traditions of writing are established and read something like Dickens, or go even further back, read Sir Walter Scott, or something like that, you'll find that there's way more prose than you would have in a modern book, because people liked it. People liked really long descriptions because they didn't have a lot of other stuff to do. And in kind of our modern society, people want to just get the story into themselves as efficiently as possible, I find. And that's kind of true for me as well. So for me, there's one thing you can skimp on, it's prose. I do want to talk about prose writing after I answer the next couple questions, because that's one of the hardest things to practice, and it's one of the hardest things to get right, and it's one of the hardest things for me to give any instruction on. Let's see here. Golden Sun, such good memories. One of my favorite JRPGs, definitely. And it might actually be, if you put those two games for Game Boy Advance together, it might be like one of my favorite games. It's a really effective JRPG experience. Fun little story, great little magic system, good setting. The character dialogue just works really well for a game. Usually game dialogue can be a little bit not so good. But something about written game dialogue, it ends up kind of working in that case. Ever played any of the Final Fantasy games on your free time in the past? Yes, I have played. It's easier to say the ones I haven't played. I haven't played the MMOs, really. Final Fantasy 11 or Final Fantasy 14. And I haven't played Final Fantasy 15 yet. I have it, but I haven't had time to play it. I've played almost every Final Fantasy game in the main series. And I've played Final Fantasy Tactics, all the Final Fantasy Tactics games. So I've played all the Final Fantasy games. And I am a big fan of them. Not all of them are, in my opinion, of the same quality, and I have different nostalgia for different ones. But I like JRPGs. And so if you like the approach to JRPGs, which is telling a narrative story and having some interesting game systems that pull you through the content, then Final Fantasy games are usually pretty good. I'm not sure what my favorite is, though. I have to really think about it. How much time / importance do you devote to researching topics that are outside of what you already know through reading? So all of my free time where I am doing something else. So if I'm working on the house, if I'm trying to fix something, right now we're trying to move something, doing a lot of moving boxes, I'm always listening to audiobooks, and almost always they are non-fiction. And so I listen to a lot of non-fiction books on economics, on statistics, on risk theory. I listen to a lot of ebooks I listen to a lot of audiobooks on history, in particular classical history. That's Roman history and classical Greek history. My favorite period, because it's really interesting and complex, and there's just so much to it that parallels our own, is late Roman Republic. So 2nd century BC to the 1st century BC, that 150 years, basically from Scipio Africanus up until Julius Caesar, it's about 200 years, I guess. That time period to me is very, very interesting, because the politics of Rome are very complex. And they're very complex in the imperial period as well, but the late Republic, it just... there's so much there that is worth looking at. So one of the things that you can take away from late Republic stuff is that things like the Pareto principle, which is the 80-20 rule, which is Pareto was an Italian economist, I guess, and he noticed that 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the people. This exact phenomenon was noticed by the ancient Romans, and there was a lot of political strife about how they were going to correct this problem and some of the problems it created. There was homeless problems in ancient Rome because of people that eventually lost their land. They didn't own their land anymore. They had nowhere to be, and they had nowhere to live in the city. They just kind of roamed the countryside. So there were homeless problems in ancient Rome. There were problems with the distribution of wealth and land in particular. All of the things that have an impact on modern society had an impact on ancient Rome. And the crazy part is that people try to propose the same solutions, which didn't work in ancient Rome. Eventually, if you look up the brothers, the Gracchi, was Tiberius and what was his older brother's name? Gaius Gracchi, Gaius Gracchus. They had these land reform bills that they kept trying to push through the assembly and the Senate. And in those land reform bills, they were trying to divvy up public land and give it away to the people and to soldiers, and generals kind of took control of this and wanted to give it to their soldiers. And famously, some different generals, including Sulla, were apportioning land out to soldiers that were had fought for them to redistribute the land. But within a generation or two, it was back to 80-20. That the solution ended up not having any kind of permanence as far as fixing the problems of inequality in ancient Roman society. So I listened to a lot of audiobooks on that. The last one I listened to on that particular topic was called The Storm Before the Storm. So The Storm Before the Storm. And I do recommend that one because rather than going, I'm going to write it down in chat here, rather than going just as a historical list of events, which can be really boring, it follows characters, right? Like we were reading a story. So there's one that focuses on you focus on Gaius Gracchus for a chapter and everything he did and how he ended up being killed and thrown into the Tiber River by the Senate. So the senators came out. They didn't want this vote on this land bill. They killed Gaius Gracchus and threw him in the Tiber. And then his brother, Tiberius, was also killed by a Roman consul during a very short period of dictatorship. So that's also interesting to look at. So that was the last one I listened to. It's a good one. It's a lot easier to contextualize a lot of the facts when they're presented that way. Of course, I have studied this in the past, so it's easy for me as well. So that little diatribe. Let's see, other questions. Do you think the main plot and main issue of a story has to be revealed, made clear at an early stage of the story, or can the main character wander around for a bit? The main character can totally wander around for a bit. I think that is totally acceptable. A lot of the classic books have that. So if you read Great Expectations, there's no clear goal until the first big plot point. So usually things as far as end goals start to come into play in what they call the first plot point, where you've done exposition on the setting, you've presented a possible conflict, and then the character is finally engaged in that conflict and has to do something. That's kind of where, like even with Star Wars, Luke isn't engaged against the Empire until he takes the droids to Obi-Wan, and then a bunch of events happen that kind of force him to do things. So it's okay for your characters to wander around a bit, but you have to have something that the reader's really interested in at the beginning. So the setting has to be exposed in an interesting way, or the character has to be doing something interesting. One thing you could do is have him have one goal at the beginning, and then that changes by the first plot point and something bigger and more important happens. So I think it's pretty important to have some kind of goal, but if you have nothing and they're just wandering around, then there has to be something really interesting about him wandering around. So it's probably better to just start with the conflict if you can. But if there's something important about him wandering, like he's a wanderer, he has no direction in life. Maybe he's a wandering samurai, and he shows up somewhere and has to do something. And so by the end of the first chapter, you have a conflict. Or, if you read Wheel of Time, the conflict is not really apparent until a big event happens, I think in the second or third chapter, where all of these like bad guys attack, all these goat monsters. I'm trying to remember what they were called in Wheel of Time. But they all attack with these half-men and stuff, and then the heroes have to escape, and there's still no end goal, but there's an immediate pressing issue that's making them do something. They have to escape from the bad guys, and Moraine is going to help them escape from the bad guys. So as long as there's something important that the character's doing, you don't have to have that end goal in mind right at the beginning. I know that's a lot on that. Do you think modern writing business suffers from Tolkien syndrome? It looks to me that everyone wants to write a long, often more than 3, 6, 10 book series, 1,000 page each. Yeah, it's a so people are going to do whatever people buy, and so the biggest, most successful books of the 20th century were all series for the most part, with some exceptions, right? So Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote that as one book, but it was released as a series. And this is actually something that goes back to the 19th century, was releasing things in volumes. So volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. That way you can sell the book 3 times rather than sell it one time as a long book. So Lord of the Rings is 3 books, Harry Potter's 7 books. So being able to sell a series is really good business. So the reason it's good business isn't just people buy 7 books. That's part of it. But you're able to predict that an audience is going to purchase the next book. So if you think about Harry Potter as a great modern example, the first book, whatever, probably no one was reading it back then. Second book, it started to get popular. And by the third book, it was a hit series, like a hit kid series. By the fourth book, it had become a hit series for like everyone. And by the 5th book, there was so much demand that people couldn't get the book on launch day. They had to print millions of copies of it to try to get people in. And then they printed, of course, the first edition of book 5, Order of the Phoenix, actually has mistakes in it. And my sister has the first edition copy that we bought I think we bought it at a coffee shop when we were out doing something. We're like, oh, there it is. Let's buy it. And so there's like a big plot hole that didn't get fixed and went out to printers. Like there's a bunch of things, but being able to predict that you're going to have a lot of sales is a big, big positive, because that means you're not taking a risk. Most of the time, if a publisher is publishing a new author, they're taking a big risk because they're spending money printing a book. They're going to spend money editing and proofreading the book. They're going to spend money promoting the book, and then they hope that they're going to recoup that. With a series, all of that work is done. Like they don't really have to promote it. They don't even really have to make sure it's well edited. In the case of J.K. Rowling, getting it out on time was more important than making the editing process have actually been accomplished. So that book shipped with plot holes and typos all over the place. But it didn't matter. Very few people look back on that other than me noticing them. It didn't really affect the story. But very few people look back on that and remember that the editing basically wasn't finished for the initial run of the 5th Harry Potter book. Being able to predict that that's going to be a huge success, it's like your investment's just paying dividends. Indie authors really like series as well, and they like them because readers tend to like them. And it also, there's a business thing to it. You give away the first book in a series, people read it, like it, they buy the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. Then you have a consistent reader. So you can look at your sales and be like, I think there's 1,000 people who want to buy book 5, and so let's see if I can get all those 1,000 people to buy the book. You can track demand. Versus if you write something new and weird, you don't know if people are going to like it. So it's actually kind of a risk management strategy if you think about it from that perspective. You are favoring a strategy which has probably less potential for most people, has less potential for like a black swan. In fact, it has no potential if you're in a series to exceed the sales of the previous versions, but it's predictable. So the predictability is big. So it has the potential to be maybe a black swan event over time, but the main thing is it's predictable. And because predictability is a risk management factor, that's why we'd like to see those. The other thing is fantasy authors are always comparing themselves to Tolkien. And so they think they have to write long books with extremely complex world building. Well, I like Moorcock. I like Tolkien as well, but Moorcock wrote short books that were extremely action-packed and very, very interesting and full of character drama, rather than full of extensive world building. But the world building in Michael Moorcock's books is very good. It's not like he didn't write new languages. It's mostly about the plot and the character drama. So that's why I think series are a big deal. Read Fortress of the Pearl recently. It's an awesome book. I think that's my favorite Elric book, actually, is Fortress of the Pearl. It's amazing that it's only 120 pages or so. It feels like it should be way longer for how much stuff is packed into it. Yes, it's very efficient. It's one of the things I love about that book. And that book is great. You can just read it on its own. You don't even have to read it as part of the series. It's a great story on its own, has excellent character drama. The descriptions are very efficient, but they're extremely imaginative. If you guys want to know, most of the book is spent traveling through somebody's dreams. So it's like it borders on Bizarro. So it's like Bizarro fantasy because you're in this dreamland. But things are so interesting and the resolution is so interesting as a result. I kind of think it was either ripped off or inspired one of the Vampire Hunter D books, which I know I'm going to sound like a total weeaboo talking about Vampire Hunter D books, but there was one where it turns out like everybody's living inside a dream and nobody realizes it. And it was this woman who like got bit by a vampire and dreamt up all these people. So it was like a simulation Matrix thing. And he killed them all by like ending this person's dream in life. It was a bunch of spoilers, but it was a very interesting take on that, on the idea of being within somebody's dream. What do you think about how literature is taught in school? I don't think I read anything in high school that had any sort of effect on me. I think it turned me off to reading for several years. Lots of people feel that way. I'm going to return to that. I just got a super chat. Just interrupting for $100 from Shenlong. Thank you. I am very humbled by that. Just interrupting your chat to say thank you again for your Star Wars videos and that you created since December of last year. I don't want to hijack your chat and discussion, but wanted to show my appreciation again. I really, really do appreciate that. And I do have an analysis that will be coming out for episodes 5 and 6. I wanted to take my time with them, and I actually wanted to watch Empire Strikes Back a couple of times because there were some things that I really wanted to pay better attention to with the way characters are presented. And so I'll get to that. I think the reason everyone likes Empire Strikes Back is the characters and the character drama. Not so much the plot. The plot, I mean, if you want the best plot, it's probably the first Star Wars movie, 1977. If you want the best character drama, it's definitely Empire Strikes Back. And if you want the best revelation of the world, I think Empire Strikes Back does a great job of that. It's definitely one to pay attention to, and it breaks all the molds as well, which is also something I like to point out. It doesn't follow the strict screenplay structure that you're told to follow. It breaks like all the rules, and as a result, it becomes memorable and interesting and does things better than probably a regular screenplay would do. Let me go back to this comment. How literature is taught in schools, and it turns kids off to literature. I think it has less to do with the books. The books that are being chosen for people to read, I believe, is part of it. And that's because they're chosen not because they're effective, but because they're important. And literature as a study, especially in the academic world, doesn't focus very much on anything that's effective. This is why going to a university to study English or study composition, usually, I mean, especially if you're studying something like comparative literature, it's not going to give you a lot of the tools you actually need to write books and be successful with it, or write books that you even like. And that's because you're focusing on what the Academy has decided is important in literature rather than things which have been proven to be effective. So if you really were taking a literature class on what are the most effective books, you would look at the books who've really persisted over time and continue to be enjoyed. You'd be reading like Sherlock Holmes. You'd be reading, you would read Mark Twain in a regular literature class. You would read, you'd be reading Conan the Barbarian, right? You'd be reading Robert E. Howard stuff. You'd be reading Tolkien, you'd be reading J.K. Rowling. You'd be reading Michael Crichton stuff. You'd be reading a lot of bestsellers from the past. You'd be reading Shogun by James Clavell. You'd be reading these books that kind of stuck around and people really liked and were really effective and really moved people over time, rather than reading something like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which is really a bad book to read, but was thought of as politically important at the time, and really is politically important at this time because it has a socialist message. So that says something about that, right? So rather than reading like Marxist literature, you'd be reading things that people actually liked to read, even in the past, and be looking at how they were effective and why they were effective. You might read A Tale of Two Cities, and you might read Three Musketeers, and you might decide why those were effective and what about the stories were gripping and interesting, rather than reading, say, Evelina, which I think Frances Burney wrote that, right? One of the first novels. It's not a very fun read, mostly because most people are not 18th century middle class British women. So they're not really going to connect with anything that the story tries to communicate. Whereas if they were to read Sir Walter Scott from, a little bit later, even though Ivanhoe's maybe a tough read compared to Michael Crichton, there's a really good story there. And so there'd probably be more to talk about, more interesting things to talk about. Trying to read Beowulf in Anglo-Saxon, that's an interesting academic experience, but not one that most people enjoy. So I think that's a lot of it, is that it's a predetermined course that you have to read, and it's like you got to read one of these and one of these and one of these and one of these, and so the student's never allowed to focus on what he or she actually really enjoys reading, except for book reports. And then it's like you need to do a book report, and then teachers can't resist but have some sort of approved list for book reports. In a lot of cases, it's like, no, that book is not good for a book report, no reading that, you must read something like this. That tends to happen a lot. And so the kid is relegated to reading things that he or she wants to read and then having to do a book report on them. And the book report is usually something that's incredibly boring and annoying to try to write. So you don't ever talk about the things you really like about the book. You have to summarize the plot. It's a lot of stuff that makes reading into work rather than reading as like a pleasure activity. And that's one of the things that I can compliment J.K. Rowling on. Is J.K. Rowling got a lot of people to pick up books and read, and a lot of kids to pick up books and read and enjoy them. And all of the devices that she used that were effective for doing that got people to enjoy a book. So even if you think the stories are garbage, the fact that you read them is a big deal, because a lot of people don't read anything. So I think our approach to literature, but that's probably true of anything. Like, most people don't like math. Right? But math can be very interesting. The problem is you don't ever apply math. Your application of mathematical concepts ends about the 5th or 6th grade. You get basic geometry, you learn how to figure out the area of a triangle, and then beyond that, you're not using any of it, and you're never required to apply any of it. So when it comes to time to actually apply math, and in cases where knowledge of math would be very, very beneficial, even somebody that's a extremely educated scientist cannot understand something like the power values of some of the data that they're looking at. Or they may understand it only enough that they just hack the p-values, and nobody in the peer review process can catch the math tricks that people use, because nobody understands math. And that they don't understand math because you're just taught to solve math problems. You're never taught to really use math. And there's so many like thought errors that people make because they don't understand math. It's really kind of a bizarre thing, because math can be very fun and very important, but we never put it in a context where we really use it. And there's also a gap between, algebra and the calculus necessary to compute complex data. That's another thing, right? Economics can be very interesting, but state-approved economics textbooks rarely talk about the fun things in economics. They're very politically correct, and they, the number of people that come out of an economics class, even at the university level, thinking that you can stimulate the economy, that the government is capable of stimulating the economy, is like, people say, well, you need to cut taxes, we need to pay down the debt to stimulate the economy. It's like, you don't really create economic stimulus that way. You just move, you just move money. And like, here's a bunch of economics papers that I've read that basically say you can't stimulate the economy, that the business cycle just kind of goes on its own. And people are like, no, that's crazy. We need to cut taxes to stimulate the economy. We cut taxes because people should have their money. not because you need to stimulate the economy. Milton Friedman was very clear on this. He's like, it won't stimulate the economy. I just think people should have more of their money. So the amount of math that can like be interesting in your life is a lot, but we never teach it in that way. I mean, it's the same thing with history. I can sit here and talk about really important things, fun things in history, and chances are people are like, oh, I never read that in history. I never read about how Gaius Gracchus, the Senate got mad at him when he was trying to pass an assembly bill and killed him and threw him in the Tiber River, beat him to death with chair legs. And like, oh, I never read that in a book. It's like, you might have, but it was contextualized in such an uninteresting way that you just forgot it. It just became noise. Most of what we learn in school is just noise. It's not useful. The amount of useful information that you acquire kind of stops for most people around the 6th grade. And then 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, it's just adding more knowledge into like a noisy environment where you don't know what's relevant, what's not. Kids go out into the real world, they realize none of the things they learn in school have any kind of application. And then the things that they did learn but forgot, they have to relearn. You know, they're like, oh, I'm going to go be a machinist. And the machinist's like, well, you do this and this and this, how you measure this. And it's like, I don't know how to measure the area of a circle. What's the formula? And it's like, that was the one thing that was really relevant. And you just forgot it after the test because in the academic environment, everything's noise. You know, so it's like, it's part of the problem with the academic environment. I don't have a great solution other than do as much self-learning as you can. And then you'll be more and more immune to that. Let's keep going. Where would you recommend someone start writing his first story? Other than basic high school, no real education in writing. Where would you begin? I'd begin at the kitchen table, at your computer. All right. Well, so most people are going to say write a short story. I'm going to say write a scene. A scene can be a short story. A scene is there to communicate something. And in a scene, just like with a story, a scene can be a microcosm of a story. So in a scene, you still have characters setting plot. You have characters that are talking to each other. You have a place that they're talking in, a setting. And then you have something important that they're talking about or experiencing while they're talking, a plot. So you could write a story that's as simple as, in fact, I wrote like I wanted to see how short a story I could write. I think I wrote like a 250-word story that was like, Claire woke up and her husband wasn't in bed and she looked over and she saw that his gun was gone. Now, just in that one sentence, I've communicated character setting plot. And then you can follow that up. Bert, where are you? And she didn't hear a response and she went down and the kitchen door was swinging open and he was gone. Right? Now, in that one scene, there's a whole lot of emotion and potential conflict. They're setting characters of plot and there's even dialogue. But it's really short and it's really simple. So start with one scene, just something that you imagine. You imagine a scene happening and have something happen in that scene and have somebody react. And then look at it and read it and see what you like about it. And then you can rewrite it, write it a different way, or write one that goes after that or is a companion with it. That one scene can be a short story on its own, or like a micro story, a flash fiction story, if you will. Or it can be part of something larger, but whenever you're constructing a book, you're constructing it scene by scene by scene by scene by scene. So it's important to understand that the micro will contribute to the macro. I said before, writing short stories has limited potential to help you write a book. And the main thing it helps you write is the prose. It helps you write the scenes. It helps you write the prose and the dialogue. That is practice that will actually help you write a book. So that's probably a good place to start. Start with one scene. Don't even try to write a whole story. Try to write 2 pages of a scene where something happens that's important and has some kind of emotional impact. So I gave you an example. A wife wakes up and her husband's gone and she notices his gun is missing from the table. She can't find him. Well, that can be a very potentially emotional scene. Or, a mom turns around and her baby's not there. Right? I'm going to fear because that's always an easy way to grip someone is with fear. Or a husband catches her wife cheating. A man goes home and finds his wife packing her bags and she's leaving him. Like, all of those are really potentially highly impactful scenes. So try writing one and see what you can come up with there and see what that inspires you to do next. And before you know it, you may have a short story in mind or a whole book, and you can try that. Are you into Warhammer 40k universe or the Warhammer Fantasy universe? I played the games. Played the RTS games, and I played Warhammer Online. That was kind of sad that didn't turn out very good, but I like the universe quite a bit, but I don't know as much about it probably as other people. What's the best written TV drama to you? Favorite? I don't watch TV, and I haven't watched TV in like almost 20 years at this point. In fact, probably I haven't consistently watched TV in about 20 years. So I watch movies. Occasionally I will watch a series on Netflix. The only series that I am really willing to watch are Star Trek. I really like Star Trek. I haven't watched any of the new Star Trek series because everyone was pooping on it. And also I'd have to buy a subscription to some streaming service I don't want to watch it. So I haven't watched Star Trek Discovery, but I like Star Trek. That's one of the only 1 hour shows I ever bothered to watch. I watched a few episodes of Walking Dead, then decided I didn't have time for it. So I don't know. I saw George R.R. Martin in news headlines today online and cringed. Do you think that he's done considerable damage to contemporary literature? I don't think he's done any damage to contemporary literature. I don't think it's possible to do damage to literature. Because if you do damage to it, what do people do? Well, they just read something else or they change their buying habits, and that enriches somebody different. So it's not possible to damage a market by being an individual who says dumb things or doesn't put out books on time, or whose books inspire people to copy, right? Like if everybody's copying George R.R. Martin, like who cares? If you don't like George R.R. Martin, there's still thousands of books that aren't his. And it's like, well, I want to be successful and everyone wants me to write like George R.R. Martin. Well, before George R.R. Martin, nobody wanted anyone to write like George R.R. Martin. People forget this. Like, success is not predictable. I know the industry wants people to predict. They're like, we're looking for things that are like this thing that's already successful because it's predictable, like the series. And indie authors do this as well. They heavily write to a specific market that they imagine rather than writing something that they love and care about. And I'm not going to say that there's anything particularly wrong with that, but I don't like to do that. That's not why I'm in this business. I don't need the money enough to write something that I don't really think is fun to write. So my first goal when I write is to write a story I think is cool and I enjoy writing. And if it's a success, great. And if people don't like it, then I know not to write more stories like that, or, I know to do something different. So I kind of approach it that way. And so I don't think it's possible to do considerable damage to contemporary literature. Literature moves on. It'll move on past things that are bad. Tastes will shift in ways that people can't predict. And then the next person will be doing damage to literature. People probably said that about, Michael Crichton. I'm certain people said it about Dan Brown because I remember they're like Da Vinci Code is going to ruin literature. And it's like, it didn't ruin anything. Because a book is popular enough that people who don't normally read it, that doesn't ruin literature. That just shows that like you're not writing products that have broad enough appeal. If you write a book that sells 2,000 copies, which a lot of traditionally published books, a bestseller could be like 5,000 copies, which isn't that many. It's not, that's a lot, but it's still not, it's not 100 million or something. And then somebody writes something that sells 50 million copies. It's like, Dan Brown's ruining literature by selling 50 million books. No, he's not ruining anything. He's only expanding the market. He's only bringing more people in. So I don't think it's possible. Even though I don't really like George R.R. Martin books, I read the first Game of Thrones. It was okay. But it wasn't good enough for me to want to keep reading. And this was years ago. But I have I can't watch Game of Thrones, the TV show. I watched one episode. I think I actually watched two, and it was just too boring for me. There wasn't enough happening, and I disliked all the characters, so I just didn't really continue watching it. I know some people love it, and if you love it, that's great. I don't have to like the same things as you, and I don't have to watch the things that everybody else watches. Bram Stoker, yeah, that's a good classic. I actually and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Also, like very gripping, interesting stories. There's so much good classic stuff. I'm about to begin the editing process of my novel. Any advice on how to do it efficiently? Also, do you write another novel while you edit your last one? I'm quite eager to get into something new. I don't usually write and edit at the same time. I've tried it, and it's too inefficient. So I've tried, like, I'm going to keep writing 1,000 words on something this, and then I'm going to spend my time editing. And I really just kind of need to focus on one or the other, and kind of leave the whole drafting, having to draft 1,000 words a day behind, and just focus on editing. That's me. There's no efficient way to edit, and there's no such thing as efficiency. Efficiency is not efficient. So if someone tells you here's an efficient way to edit, that efficiency will gloss over some detail that you would have missed if you had done it inefficiently. So let's say you do a close reading and you find a sentence that you just feel like you could write better. If you're focusing only on dialogue, because some people say, dude, just go through and look at dialogue, and that's not bad advice. But then you won't be paying attention to some little detail of prose that you'd be glad that you fixed. Or vice versa. People say focus on this, focus on that. Ask this question of every sentence. Like, okay, I don't think there's any particular method other than anytime something pops out to you is not good, got to fix it. Or maybe I could do this better. Try to fix it. I found high school calculus useful for min-maxing in games. Hell yeah. Yeah, calculus is useful for lots of things. Problem is there's a lot of scientists who publish papers who don't know enough calculus to figure out what their data is doing. I know that sounds like so, I don't know, so stupid to say, but you can read, a lot of people have done papers on the problems with the peer review process. Not enough people know math to figure out when they're being duped. And a lot of people think there's like randomness at play when there's not. And a lot of people think that there's no randomness at play when there is. They may be looking at noise and think they see a pattern, or vice versa. And you can know that better if you have some mathematical knowledge. Did you watch True Detective Season 1? I thought it was excellent, and I don't watch much TV. Nope, never watched it. I think the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood mightn't agree one person can start a damaging trend. It depends what you mean by damage. I don't think there's, is there such a thing as damage? Because while the literature world was burning, while you were coming out with books that everyone hated and no one wanted to read, you created popular fiction. While you were producing atonal garbage music subsidized by universities that no one wanted to listen to, jazz and rock and roll were becoming a thing. While the modern, or maybe you can even call it structuralist, while the modern music trend towards atonalism was really becoming a thing in the early 20th century, mostly at the levels of elite, which means the regular people weren't listening to it, you ended up with the recording industry creating something as cool as jazz. And jazz at this point, you can get a jazz studies degree. It went the other way. So the popular music started penetrating academia and saying, no, you must teach jazz studies because jazz is really good. But jazz is not academic. It didn't start academic. It's never been academic. It's always been done by doers. All the most popular jazz artists up until very recently never had music degrees. They just started playing and they were good and they had so much practice that and they were able to learn the rules. They were able to learn the styles and the way that music theory works, the way music works, enough through experience and the social information going both ways thing that they were able to do it, That's something that people forget, right? So jazz made penetration into academia and forced them to pay attention to it. So there's always things that go around, and there's reformations and counter-reformations. There's always an alternative. What about Russian literature? Game of Thrones. Okay, let me do this. Game of Thrones is the most overrated fantasy series ever, except for maybe Name of the Wind. Name of the Wind, I think, is way overrated. Name of the Wind to me was. I know I did a video on how to make the book cover, and I used a free program called Inkscape, and I remade the book cover for free, basically. And I'm like, this is a really cheap, easy, garbage book cover. And it kind of takes the scales off people's eyes, and they're like, "Whoa, that book cover really is lame. That's a lame, stupid book cover." But it worked. It was effective. I did that because I kept looking at this book cover, and it was one of those books that I forced myself to read because it was so boring, and the character was such a Mary Sue, and he was so annoying, and I felt like the book had been written, again, like I felt like it had been written by like a virgin, or by somebody who was just like really having an imagination for like what sexual attraction, what relationships between the sexes are with zero experience of it. That's the best way I can describe it. And I kind of felt the same way with Prince of Thorns. It was like I don't think these guys are virgins, but they write like virgins. They write like people who've never had a girlfriend, I feel like. And I know I know I'm like dumping garbage on these people. I'm sure it's lots of people like it and find it realistic, but it really took me out of the story whenever I see men and women acting, you know, the man is acting in a way that's like, no woman would like that. And the woman's like, I like that. It's like, I don't know how much time you spend around other people, man. I don't know. Like it's, I'm trying to think of a good word for it, but yeah, Name of the Wind. I think Name of the Wind's way more overrated than Game of Thrones. The first Game of Thrones book, I actually, you know, I did get to the end of it and was like, well, that was kind of cool. I kind of enjoyed that, but I just never bothered to pick up the other books. Name of the Wind was like, I will not read any more of this series. This is so boring. You know, the entire book, Name of the Wind, if Michael Moorcock had written it, it would have been a 100-page book. Like, there's not that much that happens. And you're just reusing tropes from older fantasy, just not as good. You know, it's like, read Wizard of Earth. Instead of reading Name of the Wind, read Wizard of Earthsea. You want to go back to classic, read Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. It's good. And it's actually good. And things actually have meaning. And people act like human beings to each other. It's a much better book. Okay. Russian literature. Mostly read like Dostoevsky. Haven't read a ton of Russian literature. I should probably read more of it. I probably will read more of it, but I'm not a Russian literature expert and I don't speak Russian. I think it's almost better to talk to someone who speaks Russian about Russian literature. I think you lose some stuff in translation, although the stories and the meaning behind something like Crime and Punishment is, I think they have an impact in any language. War and Peace I had a hard time reading War and Peace, but Crime and Punishment was good. Is a theme, an idea, or a statement you want to make essential to a story? Are just setting plot and characters enough to start writing a novel? Setting plot and characters are enough to start writing a novel, because the events and the people that are in it are more important than the themes. But if you have a big theme, if you have a big idea that binds it together, that is going to have a bigger impact. So setting characters and plot is one thing, but you have to think about how you're going to affect the reader. And so I think of the inverted pyramid, which is reaction, caring, thought. So reaction would be somebody's afraid and they read the book and they have to keep turning to resolve the tension of like, is the monster going to eat them? Caring is, man, I really want Tracy to figure out this relationship with Bill because, man, they're so good for each other, but they've just made these mistakes or misunderstood these things. That's caring. Thinking is like what 1984 does, where it's like, you know, how much of my reality is verifiable, right? That's a deep theme. Or, you know, the themes in Tolkien, which is like creation and subcreation, how power corrupts. Those themes tend to make you think. So the themes are where you're going to engage somebody for the longest time at the highest level, but it's the hardest thing to do. But the themes, people aren't going to get to the themes unless you have those other things. So if you look at 1984, at the bottom level, it has lots of reactions. There's a lot of fear in 1984. You care about the characters, and then you think about the importance of what he was saying about language and about how we know things are true and how language can alter our perception of reality. So theme is very important, but it's not all consuming. You can have a light theme. Like, what's the theme of a Nora Roberts book? There's no big ideas. You know, the theme is romance, right? So the theme doesn't have to be that heavy for a book to be effective. It just depends what kind of book you're trying to write. All of my books tend to have kind of a heavy idea that underlies them, that gets at the heart of what I'm really trying to say, even if I don't make it that obvious. But, you know, you don't have to have that. It's more, as long as you're executing well, it's going to come across as a good book. I appreciate your advice. I watch all your videos on writing. It's refreshing to get a non-SJW's perspective on the industry and craft. Thank you. I really appreciate that compliment. I don't think the key to being a non-SJW is to just look at reality as it is and just kind of accept it. And if you're looking at reality as it is rather than how you wish it to be, I don't think you can end up being an SJW. It just, you can't be. Consider Impressionist art paved the way for today's postmodern garbage that is now the entire focus of the art at university. It crowds out the classic art, limiting the teaching of the true art styles. Totally. That's why all the real art doesn't happen at universities, my friend. It all happens outside of it. If you want to find a great cover artist, go look at the people on the Eastern Bloc, man. So there's so many artists operating out of, like, you know, Belarus, who just have a computer and a pad and study digital art or taught it to themselves and can draw amazing book covers. You know, the guy who drew the cover of Water of Awakening, which was a painting he already drew. I just licensed the image because I liked it for the fantasy book I was writing. You know, he lives in Turkey, man. He didn't go to any Western university to learn art. And art that's popular just went around that, right? So the stuff that happens at a university, you know, it's funded through non-voluntary means. That's why that crap exists. And so people that go to the university saying, man, I really want to draw like Howard Lyon, who's a guy who does magic. He does book covers and magic cards, right? Or I really want to draw, you know, I really want to draw like Michael Whalen, or I want to paint like Michael Whalen. And they go there and they realize the instructors, not only are they not interested in teaching that, they lack the talent to do that themselves, and therefore they're not able to teach it. And it's a rude awakening for a lot of art students, and they're like, what do? I have to go learn this myself. But as a response, now it's a great time because so many people, like Noah Bradley, who's another guy who does lots of digital art kind of stuff. He does like art camp. He does classes on how to teach. Howard Lyon does classes on how to teach, or not how to teach, classes on how to paint. And Howard Lyon does very detailed classical style paintings, and you can go study with him in Utah and learn everything you need to learn from much less study than what you do at a university. And you'd probably at the other end of it have more skills, better skills, ones that are more finely attuned to what you want to do. So again, don't look at what's popular in the university as some indicator of what reality is. Universities are not in reality. They live in their own little world where they're not subject to anybody else's opinions. They get money from the government, and they get money from students who feel that they have to show up to a university to get a degree or else they can't be successful. All of which is funded by debt. I found out this week, by the way. Oh, excuse me. I was drinking out of a straw and like the water shot out. That's fun. So, found out that like some large percentage of all the student debt is held by the U.S. government as an asset. And somewhere around 40% of all the assets that the U.S. government holds are student debt. So you want to know why student debt is never going away and will only go up until the bubble explodes and everybody realizes that it's just a big freaking con game. If the government is holding the debt as an asset, they have this asset and they're like, this debt is an asset because we can collect it forever from these people who can't get rid of it through bankruptcy. They borrow against it. So all of the government spending that happens at the federal level is borrowed against an asset called the student debt, which you are paying. So your taxes are going to service debt that was taken out with your debt that you're paying as an asset, right? There's so many levels to the scam that universities are. And this is coming from someone who taught at a university and taught at a college as well, at a junior college. Junior colleges, why they're so cheap? And it's because, man, they have to operate on the cheap. They are funded by government, but people can come in and spend $50 a unit at a junior college. It's way better to do that and see what you want to do than it is to just, I'm going to go to UCLA because UCLA is a good school. So you go to UCLA, it doesn't matter what you major in, you're not going to even be taught by the professors. You're going to be taught by grad students who've never taught a day in their life, and you're going to pay thousands and thousands of dollars in room and board, tuition, which gets funneled into tenured teachers and very, very well-paid administrators. I think Janet Napolitano, who's the head of the UC system, gets paid $600,000 a year, somewhere around that, right? A lot of money. And she got that job because she was in because of political connections, right? She doesn't really know anything about running a university system other than it's like running the government, and she was part of the federal government. So those skills go across. Anyway, it's a big racket. So don't look at the university as part of reality. Yeah, it crowds out classic art in the university, but the university is pointless and stupid. You just avoid it and do what you want to do. And if you look at the market, what people buy, what people are actually paying for art, all the art that's commissioned is in the classical style. So let's take a look at that and realize that the academic stuff didn't matter. And Impressionism was not an academic art style. The academy's taking over of art didn't happen until the 20th century with the growth of the university system as something non-parochial, let's say, right? University systems in the distant past were all kind of clergy-based, oddly, but anyway, that didn't happen until after that. So Impressionism did not cause modern art. Impressionism was part of the course of study for universities, which they just wanted to take it to the next level rather than do anything original. So Claude Debussy, who's an Impressionist musician, he was considered a bad student at the university, and so he created Impressionist music, and it was very popular. And so now we learn it in universities, and people continue to try to take it to the next level and create postmodern crap. None of that started at the university. Same thing with jazz, right? It's not academic. So it makes an intrusion into the academy, and then the academy just operates in its own little weird sphere after about 1950. Okay. Read any Gene Wolfe? Book of the New Sun is fantastic in my opinion. I'll check it out. Should I read Wheel of Time? Is it as good as people such as Reddit say it is? Wheel of Time is great and terrible. Much like Rand himself. Wheel of Time is a series that starts off great. And it's a series which gets very, very bad if you are not really into the characters by about book 7. And it stays bad for a number of very long books. Then it gets kind of good. Then the author dies. Then Brandon Sanderson finishes it pretty well. So here's what I do if I was going to recommend Wheel of Time. Pick up the first book. If you like it, read until the books become boring. Then read synopsises until you get to like book 9 or 10. Try each book and see what's happening. And then you'll probably be interested again about book 10, book 11. And you can finish off the 13-book series. Be done with the series. Wheel of Time is great and bad. Now, the problem is, and this is what happens with a lot of series that are long, in the midway point, there's everything stalls out. And nothing ends up happening because there's too many threads. There's too many threads at play. So imagine you're making a carpet, right? You have or any kind of cloth. You have a warp and a weave. And so you start off with just the warp, and it's just a bunch of threads, right? And then you start doing the weaving to try to weave the tapestry, and before you know it, each color you add is another thread. And before you know it, looking at the back of the tapestry, you have hundreds of different threads of different colors, and it's hard to keep track of which colors go in where to try to make the entire image of the tapestry that you're trying to make. So when you're making something really epic with the tapestry, each one of those threads, it's like you have to keep track of it and keep working on it. By about book 7 or book 8, making one line of the image is so complex that like nothing happens. So by about book 7, 8, like Winter, I think there's like, Winter's Heart. I remember reading it and it just like nothing happened for like 800 pages. And I closed the book and I'm like, I couldn't even give a synopsis of that book because it was so boring and there's so little happening. I don't even know what happened. I don't know what was important. It was just noise. It was like this character made this much little progress. There's 20 different characters making tiny amounts of change. And rather than what a better approach would have been, let's talk about what would have been better. What would have been better is by about book 6, you stop focusing on all the characters in every book. And you just have a book, and he did this to a certain extent where like one book would be more heavy with one character than another. You have a book that's just Rand. You have a book that's just Perrin. You have a book that's just whoever else, right? Nynaeve. The Nynaeve book, right? And you have those, and it's just that, and you make that own plot very interesting, and you leave everything else out. And people would have been like, oh, this book is only Nynaeve, but I don't like Nynaeve. And you'd be like, well, you could skip that book. Rather than having the entire book be bad because it's full of, Nynaeve is 300 pages of a 900 page book, then it's 1/3 bad if you don't like Nynaeve and you don't like the constant tugging of the braid and all that kind of stuff. So give it a try, and if you don't like it, you don't have to read it, or just start reading the summaries. Let's keep. What's your from the Crusader, Deus Vult? What's your take on main characters needing to be likable or not? I'm currently writing an MC that's quite egotistical, cynical, and an alcoholic, while hoping people won't immediately be turned off. They don't need to be likable as long as they're interesting. But I would pick one likable thing about them. So you can read something like Choke by Chuck Palahniuk, good example, or Fight Club actually as well. Choke, the main character, is not immediately likable. You can also read in the fantasy genre Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, not particularly likable, but it's interesting enough that you may forgive the story for having an unlikable character. And Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, actually, that character is very unlikable, extremely unlikable, and you kind of want bad things to happen to him. So you can do that. It doesn't have to be likable as long as it's interesting and compelling to people. Yeah. No, Impressionism did not pave the way for today's postmodern garbage. Stephen King says theme doesn't matter all that much. Not sure if I fully buy that, but I definitely respect his opinion on that subject. Well, he's written a lot of very successful books, and so what matters is the execution more than the theme. If you have the best theme and you can't execute the book, again, it's the top part of the pyramid, so everything else below it has to work. You have to be affecting the reader, and you have to be making them care. You have to make them react and make them care before you can make them think. Impressionism is all about the study of light and color. It's about a lot of things. I'm reading 1984 in my English class right now. Oh, the lone good book that everyone that I talk to in California, at least, we've been reading the same books in high school for like 50 years. They're like, the only book I liked from high school was 1984 or Fahrenheit 451. It's like, yeah, you liked the sci-fi book. Who would have thought? The interesting book with interesting ideas and interesting characters. I'm in art school. It's not the place to go to learn hard skills. That is true. I don't know what skills. I don't know what a soft skill is, though. In fact, I've talked to people in art school that say, I need to stay here to network with other artists. I'm like, why do you need to network with artists? They're not your customers. Like, I might need to network with other musicians to a certain level because I need to play with other musicians. But if you're an artist, like, what do you get from that? It's like, I need to go to graduate school so that I know other artists. It's like, are they going to give you money for knowing them? Are you going to draw book covers for people? Or are you going to make comic books because they know you? Like, what is it? And most, I don't know, not that, you have to draw comic books or something, but how are you going to get a gig by having networking in art? Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, other than, hey, I don't have time for this gig. Why don't you do it? Like, okay, cool. But for the most part, I think skills are way more important than networking. You can network with the internet. So that's my opinion. I'm not a visual artist. I'm just a dude. Likability of the protagonist, unfortunately, is hugely important if you want your story to be popular. I think it's good to have at least one thing that's likable, even if everything else is not. So, like, they do this trick with screenplays. They have the save the cat. So you do it at the beginning of the screenplay, and then when the character does a bunch of stupid crap, you still like him because he's shown that he's a good guy by saving the cat. And actually, I don't think you need super likable characters. Are the characters in Godfather 2 likable? No, they're like, they're not that likable. They're harsh, right? Gangster movies are full of harsh characters, but we like to watch them be mean and nasty and do bad things and get away with it and be badass. Characters don't have to be likable as long as they're interesting and different enough from us that we feel compelled to see what they're going to do. Tony Soprano is not a super likable guy. He's a guy that is pretty evil, but it becomes interesting. House of Cards is full of extremely unlikable characters. Game of Thrones is full of extremely unlikable characters, but they're interesting, right? They're interesting even if they're not likable and not lovable. They don't have to be virtuous. Most of the time you like virtue. My university is largely funded by foreign students and their tuition. Depends on where you're at. You know, a lot of people see foreign tuition and they think foreign students are funding the university. And they find out like 80% of the budget actually comes from government grants or just the government directly. So that's the thing. Here in California, we have the CSU system, which I taught at, and then you have the USC system, which is the other system. University of California versus California State University. So a little bit different approach in each one. One's a quarter system, one's a semester system. But they're both really heavily funded by taxpayers, and it's something no one ever talks about. It's like it's huge amount of their money comes from the taxpayers, and yet they keep increasing tuition year after year. Their costs never get reined in, and it's because there's no one who ever says, I'm not going to pay that, right? Everyone's trying to get into the best university. So you think if you can go to UC Berkeley, that any cost is worth it because it's the best, or UCLA, or USC is a private one, and so is Stanford, but they're in the same market. You never stop and think about whether you're actually going to recover your money out of that education. Are you a socialist? Me? No. That's a dumb question. You guys should know better than that. Talked about character types. What are your thoughts on a mentor character? Example, a manga, My Hero Academia. All Might has a very interesting character arc. All right, so yeah, I knew there's some other topics, and maybe I'll make individual videos on them because this stream's starting to go a little bit long. Character arcs. So character arcs is about how characters change, but just as important as that is how characters interact with other characters. The drama between them and the dynamics between them, how they change in relation to each other. I hinted in a comment section in my last video, I was going to make a video on the Virgin and the Chad. It's a meme, but it reflects a very real relationship between two different types of personalities in our society and in literature and in movies and everything else. And that's the very socially successful Chad and the envious Virgin, right? And so in a story about these two personality types, like American Pie, if you guys ever saw the movie American Pie, it's about the Chad, which is Stifler, and a bunch of virgins, right? And they're all trying to be more like Stifler, because Stifler's like, you guys are virgins, la 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 la. I don't have to try, and I get everything I want, la 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 la. I'm a Chad, right? And they're like, but we try, and then we don't get what we want. Oh, we feel bad. So the goal is to become like the Chad, and then the Chad's character arc is realizing that he's not as cool as he thought he was, right? Or like, you know, that there's an emptiness to what he's doing. So he has a different character arc, and they kind of switch places when you have this dynamic. And so the friction between different roles and different characters is just as important as the growth that they make. When Luke Skywalker criticizes Han for being self-interested, that's hinting at what Han's path is going to be, but that's a conflict between them. And at the same time, Luke has to lose his naivete, and Han has to be a little bit more caring about the world beyond him. So Han's kind of the Chad and Luke's the Virgin, and they kind of have kind of crossing dissonant trajectories there. And I'll talk more about that in another video. If you're interested in economics, recommend Mark Blythe. He has some very interesting, informative videos and books. Also has a great sense of humor. All right, check it out. I think I've probably seen or heard some before, or maybe even read some. I can't keep track of every like nonfiction book I listen to or read. In the Bay Area, private university, majority of students are Chinese or Korean. Yeah, I noticed that. You know, people kind of comment on that. Like you go over to UCLA, it's like 70% East Asian, and people are like commenting that like that's a problem. I'm like, well, it's more that more Asians are getting duped. And the funny thing is, like most of the East Asians, I think their families have a little bit more pressure on them to like be in STEM or be in something that's gonna, you need to be a lawyer, you need to be an engineer, you need to do be a dentist, you need to be something productive and valuable, rather than you need to go to college, because that's the message that we get kind of piled on us at public schools, is you need to go to college, you need to go to college, you need to go to college, you need to go to college. So people go to college thinking that like that's it, right? Not thinking, well, engineers make a lot of money because they're engineers, not just because they went to college. And so they take up women's studies, And then they get a degree in it and they realize that it was a terrible money investment and they didn't really learn anything valuable. Or maybe they resist that idea because it's too hard to it's very difficult to recognize the truth when the truth says something negative about yourself. And so, maybe they have a better head on their shoulders. But that's the thing, right? Like if you're looking at affirmative action, it's like you have to discriminate against a minority, which is East Asians, Indians, and Chinese as well, or Southeast Asian, whatever. You have to discriminate against them to make room for white people. That's an interesting thought. Can someone say Elliot Rodger? I just said it. Have you ever thought of making comic book? Yeah, but I'm not a good enough visual artist, so I'd have to hook up with an artist. And then my thought always is like, man, the artist is doing all the work. Like writing the dialogue is probably the easy part, So I'd rather teach an artist how to make a good story than do one myself. But yeah, I like comic books. I'm not talented enough, or I don't have enough practice doing comic drawings that I could manage to do that well. All right. So chat's winding down a little bit. Let me talk about a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. How to write prose and how to write dialogue. So writing prose is writing the events. Tracy awoke on a cold Monday morning. You're just saying what happened. You could say Tracy woke up, but you want to add more into that makes the reader feel like they're actually experiencing some setting. So prose is about exposing setting and telling events. So she woke up on a cold Monday morning. She rolled over and hoped her alarm would turn itself off, which it never did. That describes a lot about Tracy. So we're describing the time and the place. She's in bed. It's Monday morning. The alarm's going off. She probably has to go to work. She doesn't usually want to go to work. And she's resisting having to get out of bed and do what she's supposed to. Maybe she's sleepy, and then you can keep describing. She pulled the sheets off of her bed and rolled out onto the floor, and then her feet were cold. So when you're writing prose, you have an idea of like what has to happen. She needs to get out of bed and use the bathroom. You're going to write a paragraph on that. Okay, you could just say Tracy got out of bed and went to the bathroom, but that's boring. So you try to put some more color into that. That would be like a stick figure drawing. And people don't like to look at stick figures. They like to look at paintings. So you have to paint the image. She set her feet down on the cold and jumped up slightly. Herbert, her orange tabby cat, jumped out at her startling at the cold floor and meowed plaintively at her at the bedroom door. "I'll get you dinner in a minute," she said as she stumbled to the bathroom. Her head hurt from all the wine she drank last night. Maybe you say that. Maybe you want to say that she drank too much wine last night. So you say, her head hurt as much as her normal hangover. Whoa, you communicate a lot of information there. She drinks a lot. She's got a hangover right now. That's why she doesn't want to get out of bed. You're now describing Tracy has a cat. It's an orange tabby. Her floor is cold. It's probably winter. She doesn't want to. It's Monday morning. She has to go to work. She's hungover. And she's hungover a lot because she's an alcoholic. So now I could just say, Tracy was an alcoholic. She woke up one morning and went to the bathroom. That's like the stick figure version. So when you write prose, you want to put in all of those colors. It's kind of like painting a picture. You want to have in all the interesting details that show her what you're at. So if you just say Tracy was an alcoholic, that's kind of telling, right? Versus showing like with the prose that I described. But sometimes telling is just more efficient. I always go back to this. Maybe you want to just get to the point really quickly. Tracy was an alcoholic. She woke up on Monday morning with a hangover, which was normal for her. That's a lot more Spartan way of doing it. But maybe that Spartan has a different flavor to it when I say it like that. It's like, what am I going to learn about Tracy rather than, oh, Tracy's life is sad, or I care about Tracy having a hangover. It's mostly like, what are you going to tell me about Tracy to make me interested? So there's some ideas about writing prose. You're mainly describing events and the setting, and that's where prose should come in. Dialogue. Dialogue is where the story's carried. With dialogue, you communicate a character's reaction. You communicate relationships between characters, which are very important. And you communicate a lot of details about events that are not located in a scene. Tracy got to work and was rubbing her head. Tracy, did you get those TPS reports to me? Bob said. He was leaning against the door jamb of his corner office, twirling his glasses in a circle as he watched her pretend to not be hungover on her way to her cubicle. Now, I could just say, like Tracy walked to her cubicle, "Where are those TPS reports?" her boss Bob said. Now, I didn't tell you Bob was the boss, but you got it from the way that he stood there shaking his glasses. And you also got that he's kind of arrogant. He looks down on Tracy. He's wanting to harangue her right off the bat on Monday morning. "Where are those TPS reports?" And maybe they have dialogue. I have them on my computer. I'll print them out and bring them to you by 9. It's like, well, and maybe they have some more dialogue that's like that. Or maybe she runs into a guy and she drops her files because she likes this guy. So you want to communicate that. "Oh, I'm sorry. Here, let me get those for you." "No, it's all right." And then they bumped heads. Right? You've seen the scene a million times. "Yeah, man, that's a lot of papers you've got there." "Well, Bob wanted the TPS reports brought to him by 9. Bob doesn't read those." "I know he doesn't read them, but I also don't want to get fired." "He's not going to fire you. He doesn't fire anyone." "Why doesn't he fire anyone?" It's like, because he doesn't want to get fired himself. He waits until things go bad and then he has somebody to fire. "Oh, yeah, that makes sense." So in the dialogue, I'm doing a lot of description. Now, this is not the best dialogue because I'm just doing it off the top of my head, but there's a lot of description of Bob and the relationship and what's going on. And maybe Bert is the guy that found her, right? Or Dave. Let's call him Dave. "I texted you on Friday night, but I didn't hear back from you." "Oh, yeah, I guess I left my phone in the other room and just didn't realize it." And, maybe Tracy rubs her head and then he's like, "Oh, yeah, I've done that before. Sometimes I get so involved in playing Final Fantasy, I forget that my phone's in the other room, right? Or maybe I get so involved in some hobby he has." And now he's describing a hobby to her. And he's also saying he's interested in her, but maybe we start to think like, why didn't she have her phone? Maybe she was drunk and passed out, right? Because she's an alcoholic. And so you start constructing all those details kind of indirectly. And so that's that's the way that you really want to approach it. And you really want to write dialogue the way that people are talking. You wouldn't have Bob say like, you wouldn't have Bert or Dave. You wouldn't have Dave say to Tracy, "I really wanted to ask you out on Friday, but then I didn't." And then she'd look at him and be like, "Is there something wrong with you?" And she'd be like, "Well, you should ask me out today, and then I'll go out with you Wednesday." "That's good." It's like, "I did not do it. I did not." "Oh, hi, Mark." Right? So you want it to really flow like people are talking. So if you imagine you're talking to somebody that you know and you imagine the things that they would say, that's kind of a great place to start with dialogue. And you want dialogue just like how when you talk to someone in the morning, your dialogue's communicating things about what you're doing. "Oh, how are you doing, Dave?" "Well, I woke up this morning and had a terrible sinus headache from the fires." You notice my voice, by the way, is a little scratchy. It's because of the forest fires. It's like, "Oh yeah, I couldn't go out running last night because of that." It's like, "I haven't been able to go running in 2 weeks." What did we learn about Dave and whoever he's talking to? Well, the guy he's talking to is a runner. "I haven't been running in 2 weeks." Some people never run at all. If you're upset about not running in 2 weeks, like, I guess I'm the guy talking to Dave because I haven't gone running in 2 weeks from the fires. But, "Oh, this guy's a runner. He exercises a lot and you're learning things about him." So dialogue communicates a lot about people. That's how you get to know people in real life. You talk to them. So the characters get to know each other by talking to them as well. And it's better to have more dialogue than's necessary and have it feel a little bit more natural than to have virtually no dialogue that's just really to the point. Because if it's too to the point, it's too on the nose, it feels awkward and like, "Oh, hi, Mark. Hey, how's your sex life?" If you watch The Room, that's a great example of terrible dialogue. The Force of Shemale. Funny you say that about Luke and Han. I watched a vid with the scenes that got cut from Empire Strikes Back. Luke and Leia get really intimate with each other. We almost got a petty romance arc for Luke. Yeah. There's actually a lot that's communicated through dialogue at the beginning of Empire Strikes Back. "Oh, the rebellion needs me to stay. What about you? You're a great leader." And Han gets angry and storms off. He's communicating through that dialogue indirectly that he He really likes Leia, and he wants her to say that she cares about him. He wants her to commit to caring about him, not caring about the idea. And he gets frustrated that she won't. So there's a good piece of dialogue from Empire Strikes Back. And the thing is, it's actually kind of hammy when you just hear it, but it communicates a lot kind of indirectly. And they really front load that exposition. It sets up the entire relationship within the first few minutes of the film. Thankfully, it did get cut. That would have been way weirder for Return of the Jedi, where it's like, Leia's your sister. And that's the best part about Lucas, is like things that he cuts, he's like, well, now I can just kind of make her his sister. Why not? It's like, let's do it. I'm an underappreciated genius. Thank you. You don't have to kiss my ass. You don't have to kiss my ass to make me like you. But you're free to do it. I always have a shit ton of dialogue for some reason. Sometimes I feel like it drags on for a while, though, which begs the question of how much dialogue is needed and what is too much. As a slightly autistic commenter posted on some other video, it raises the question, not begs it, because begging is a circular reasoning thing, right? So yeah, how much dialogue is needed and what is too much? It's too much if it's boring. And it's too much if you're not communicating anything with like setting characters plot. Or it's too much if it's too much on one of those things. So characters don't sit around and talk about the setting that they live in. They don't sit there and go like, yeah, so we have checks and balances in our government. Yeah, I know. We have an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. Yeah, so how about that judicial branch? Right? They, like, if you feel like you're doing that when you're exposing your setting, that's not the way to do it. It'd be better to just do that directly in dialogue, maybe as like a prologue. Sometimes world building in fantasy, people try to do it indirectly, and it adds too much to the dialogue, because people don't talk about the world they live in that kind of way. They talk about the things that are immediately relevant to them. They don't say like, so what's your opinion on the Supreme Court? They'd be like, oh, did you see that all the women that accused Justice Kavanaugh of rape have all been found to be lying? It's like, no, I didn't hear that. It's like, that's because the mainstream media never talks about it. And then all of a sudden you have characters having an interesting conversation with each other, right? So there you go. I managed to misspell that as well. Jesus, I'm getting tired. And it's probably late where you guys are at. It's almost 11 o'clock. So that's probably going to be it for this stream. Talked about dialogue. Next time I'm going to talk a little bit more about character dynamics. I want to make that video on the Virgin and the Chad, because it's a theme for male characters that runs very strongly. For female characters, it's a different dynamic. It'd be like the cheerleader and the bookworm or something. But for the Virgin and the Chad, it's this idea of social desires and success and effort and jealousy that just pervades lots of different literature. And that's why when I say that, like, Name of the Wind reads like it's written by a virgin, maybe not a literal virgin, but the guy who occupies the virgin slot in the meme, the guy who's like walking with his head down, like listening to his music, going like, I'm going to study math and make money, and then girls will like me. And the Chads over here, like, I don't care that I have millions of flaws. People like me anyway. You know, you probably don't want to be either of those, but when I read a book like Name of the Wind, I feel like it's the virgin writing a book about how he's really going to be good and the Chad is stupid, That's the best way I can describe it. Describe that thing there. So if you're a balanced person, you can see both sides and you can see yourself in both roles. And in one level, you can be very socially successful, and in another, you can feel very socially unsuccessful. So you're never, as a human being, you're never, I'm a bad boy. You never fit into these archetypes and these dynamics that meta dynamics we see with characters. But you should be able to see yourself in any of them. Everybody's got a little bit of a bad boy in them. Everybody's got a little bit of an everyman. The idea of the everyman is that he's got a little bit of everyone in him, So anyway, that's about that for today. Norway here, it's almost 5 a.m. Damn. Oh, but it's so cold there too. I wish I was there, because right here it's actually cold here in California because the forest fires are burning so intensely that they block out the sun. So I'm like in nuclear winter. It's getting down to like freezing every night, which it almost never freezes in this part of California. You never get a freeze unless you're up in the mountains, where it snows all the time. But boy, it's, man, thanks for staying up. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. I am going to reiterate, you can get one of my books for free. It's Water of Awakening, which is my high fantasy adventure novel, which has a great journey beyond reality into a bizarro land and back again. It has dragons, it has sorcery, it's got crazy demi-humans, and lots of gore, and talking ravens as well. I'm a fan of the talking ravens. So you guys can check that out if you want. I also have a Teespring store that I'm experimenting with for monetization. You can check it out if you want to buy a t-shirt that supports the channel. You can buy Zool t-shirts, which is the music, and I do have a Muramasa t-shirt and a Muramasa sweatshirt in white from the original book cover, which I have here somewhere. So if you want to see, it'll be this book cover, which is fun. I kind of like the white and red. It reminds me of Kill 'Em All by Metallica, so I kind of like that. That you can get that as a shirt. I'll probably have more. It's just a way that you can give me money and get something if you want to continue giving me money. Otherwise, you can check out Patreon. I'll have some stuff up by the end of the month for patrons only, which is some previews of some books that I have completed this year, and then we'll be probably editing later on. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope you guys will have a great day. One of the ravens is called Zool, and that's the name of the album. Yeah. And thank you, Perspectives. Thank you guys for all the compliments. I really appreciate it. I will see you guys next time. And Saturday's the noise stream. So I'm doing a noise stream on Saturday. That's going to be all the other stuff. I can't help but dip into politics even while I'm talking about writing, but I really want to put that in its own place where I can like talk about the midterm elections and Broward County and all that kind of stuff. And Comicsgate. I'm going to talk about Comicsgate. I'm going to have some interesting perspectives for you guys on that because I've witnessed some interesting things, and so I'll talk about that a little bit, just some of the noise surrounding that stuff. So that's going to be on Saturday, probably in the afternoon. I'll have more up about that. And then I'm going to try to keep that schedule from now on. I'm probably going to miss a week when I move because that's going to be unavoidable. And then after that, I'll be back on a 2-time-a-week streaming schedule with I'm going to try to do 2 videos a week in between that are a little bit bigger. Sometimes I have to take a week off. Like when I do the Empire Strikes Back video, I'll probably just do 1 video that week because I have a bunch of lecture notes that I want to have for that. And that just takes a little more time. So thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time. Oh, by the way, any topics that you want for that noise stream, let me know. Like send me an email or put it in the comments or put it up on Patreon or whatever, and then I'll get to it. Thanks.